Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. Welcome back to episode 4 of my Stephen King Ranking Decades series. And for this episode, it's going to be part 1 of the 90s, where I'm going to be looking at all the Stephen King books that he wrote in the 1990s and ranking them based on my enjoyment. And just like with the 80s decade, which I've done a video for that, and I'll link that down below, I'll have to split this up into 2 parts. So part 1 is going to be essentially my least favorite from the 1990s, and then part 2 is going to be my favorites from the 1990s. But I will be perfectly honest with you, the 1990s is probably my least favorite Stephen King decade. None of the books that Stephen King put out in the 1990s I would put in my top 10. None of them. And a lot of them, especially the ones that I have to talk about in this video, they would probably be closer to the very bottom, like in my bottom 20 of his 70 plus novels. A lot of them would be very low on my list. So probably the 90s is my least favorite. But there are still a lot of great ones. Most of the ones that I think are great are going to be in part 2. And like I said, part 1 here is going to be mostly about my least favorites. But there are some, it's not like a lot of these books are like terrible by any means. They're just not my favorites, and you know, they gotta rank somewhere here, right? So I also just wanted to quickly mention that I'm taking 2 things into account when I'm ranking all of these books. Number 1 being my overall enjoyment level, which is pretty common, right? Like, how much did I like these books? How much did I enjoy reading them? But then number 2 is rereadability. How often am I going to go back and reread these books? And obviously, you know, my favorite books, I'm going to tend to reread more. And then my least favorite books, I'm probably going to reread less. But there are some books that even though I didn't like them the first time, maybe I'm more inclined to try them a second time, give them a second chance, right? To see if I like them more. But then there's books that are just like bad, and I know I'm not going to enjoy it the second time. So those are definitely going to be a lot lower. So just wanted to give y'all like a thought process for how I rank all of these. Without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. All right, so if I did my math correctly, I believe I have 17 books to rank for part 1 and part 2. So jumping off the list at number 17, we have Storm of the Century, which is not really a novel. It's actually more of a screenplay. Like if you look at, you know, the actual text of the book, it's written like it's a script, and which makes sense because this was turned into, I think like a mini series on like ABC or something. I watched it a long time ago, and it was very good. I really enjoyed it. And essentially when you read it, you literally get the exact same thing because it's literally just the script from the screenplay, from the miniseries. So it's not one that I would want to read just because I could literally get the same story by just watching the screenplay. So it comes in at the bottom just because while it is good, I really don't feel the need to ever reread it again because I can just go watch the miniseries, which is actually pretty good. I'm not going to say it's like great, but it's definitely worth watching. So for that reason, I'm going to put Storm of the Century at number 17 on the list at the very bottom. And for number 16, I'm sure many constant readers would highly disagree with me on this one. I mean, they'll probably disagree with more stuff on the list, but I think definitely with this one. So number 16 is Insomnia. This one I was pretty excited to get to when I read it for the first time years ago. I'd heard a lot of people say it's really good and it connects to the Dark Tower, so you got that going for it, and I got really excited for it. But I was severely let down. I was bored through most of this book. I didn't really care for the main character that much. And basically the saving grace for this book is that Dark Tower connection. I did like that. I did enjoy it. but it wasn't enough for me to like really enjoy it. Like it's nowhere near my favorite, and obviously it's number 16 on the list here, so it's close to the bottom. And it's just not a book that I ever want to, I mean, I probably will reread it sometime in the distant future, but for right now, I have no plans on rereading it anytime soon. So for those reasons, I'm going to have to go with number 16, Insomnia. And for number 15 on the list, we're definitely going to make some constant readers mad here, which is always fun. For my money, this is his most overrated book. A lot of King fans love it, but I just was kind of disappointed with it. Not terrible, but kind of meh. All right, enough beating around the bush. Number 15 is The Stand, which is the complete and uncut version that he released in 1990. The original version came out in 1978. I haven't read the original version, and I would like to, because I'm pretty damn sure I would like it a lot more than this literal brick of a book. Like, you could literally, like, build a house with, like, a bunch of these books. So for me, in typical King fashion, when he writes longer books, part 1 is great. Like, part 1, when I read it, was amazing. And then part 2 bored me to death. And then part 3 had good moments, but the ending for me was just bad. I did not enjoy the ending. It's got good Stephen King characters, really good characters, but for me, just the pacing is just god-awful, and the ending is bad, and part 1 was great, but then after that, it turns into a completely different book. And for me, like I said, it's his most overrated book. I know a lot of King fans love it, but for me, it's probably not one that I want to reread a lot. Maybe I'll go back and give it another shot, but for me, it comes in near the bottom of the list at number 15. Number 14 on the list, I'll be curious to see what people think about this, and that would be Bag of Bones, which, again, not one of my favorites. I remember just not really enjoying this book very much. I believe I gave it like 2 stars. But again, I have not read this book in such a long time that I'm very curious to see what I would think about it upon a reread. And I actually don't remember too much about it. I remember the first few chapters being great. And then after that, there were some story elements that I didn't love. But I'm very curious to see what I would think upon a reread, which is why it's higher than some of the other books on the list. Even though I probably enjoyed them more than this one, I'm ever so curious to see. And let me know what you guys think about this book, because I don't really hear a lot of people talk about this one. So I'm very curious to see what y'all think. But for now, I'm going to go with Bag of Bones, number 14 on the list. And number 13 on the list, we're going to have to go with Rose Matter, which this novel was fairly disappointing for me, only because the first half of this book I thought was great. I loved the main character of Rose, and basically her having to flee her abusive husband, who is basically following her because he's a cop, and like that whole tension. And I really liked her character, and I really liked the story for the first half, but then King kind of shoehorns in a supernatural element that I just thought was dumb, and the ending was kind of dumb. But so it's kind of a hard book to rank because I love the first half, and the second half it's just not that great. But I would be interested to go back and reread it, and it does help that it's a bit shorter and the pacing is pretty decent. It's just the second half was not what I wanted it to be, but it is still decent. And for that, I'm going to put it at number 13 on the list, Rose Matter. And number 12 on the list, we have Hearts in Atlantis, which for me, the first time I read this, I was reading it and really enjoying it, and I was very much anticipating it, putting it like in my top 20, possibly my top 10 Stephen King books of all time. But that was mainly because of the first two novellas in the collection, which the first two novellas are pretty good. I've reread them and I didn't like them as much the second time, but I still thoroughly enjoyed them. The problem for me is always the last three stories, because if you didn't know, this novel, I think it's technically called like a mosaic novel, where you get a bunch of stories and they all kind of connect in the end. The two novellas are great, but then there's three short stories that conclude the collection, and they're always very forgettable for me. I don't enjoy them nearly as much as the two novellas. So for me, it feels a bit clunky in that way, where I really want to go back and read the novellas, but then I don't really care about the other stories. So again, it's hard for me to rank it, but I think for that reason, like just loving the novellas and then being kind of down on the short stories, it's kind of in the middle here, and I'm going to have to go with Hearts in Atlantis at number 12 on the list. And number 11 on the list is a book that I'm currently reading with a lot of y'all, and that would be Nightmares and Dreamscapes, which is his third short story collection. And if you didn't know, I'm running the Stephen King short story book club, where we're going back and reading all of Stephen King's short story collections. And we started this on July 4th. And since this is a bit chunky, we're actually going to read this until December. And like I said, it is chunky. And for that reason, it is probably my least favorite of his short story collections, just because it's the same amount of short stories that are in Night Shift, but it's double the length, which is crazy. He's just, his editor or whatever at this time just didn't give a crap. He's just like, write whatever you want. And all the stories in here, or I should say most of the stories in here, you can definitely feel its length, and they're just too long and too rambly. And yeah, for that reason, it's probably my least favorite of his collections. But I am still excited to reread it because I haven't read it in a while. And I'm thinking reading it at a slower pace will actually make me like it more, because the first time I read it, I binged through it and I was just like, oh, this is so much Stephen King short stories. But I think going through it slowly will definitely benefit me and definitely benefit all of the people who are joining in the read-along. So for that reason, I'm going to have to put that at number 11 on the list. Nightmares and Dreamscapes. And speaking of collections by Stephen King, I'm going to have to go with, for number 10, 4 Past Midnight, which is actually his novella collection. And just like with Nightmares and Dreamscapes being too long, yeah, this is too long of a novella collection. And again, there's only 4 Past Midnight. There's 4 novellas, and again, they're longer than they need to be. And for me, the main reason why it's lower on my list, and the main reason it's probably my least favorite novella collection, is because I really enjoy the first 2 novellas, which would be The Langoliers and Secret Window, Secret Garden. But then the last 2, The Library Policeman, I really just don't enjoy. Kind of a silly concept for me. And then The Sundog is fine. Probably should have been more of a short story. That one's got some cool elements to it. But for me, it's like a Jekyll and Hyde kind of deal, where the first 2 are really good and then the second 2 are kind of meh. So for that reason, again, kind of like with Nightmares and Dreamscapes, it's sort of near the middle of my list here, and I'm going to have to go with number 10, 4 Past Midnight. And for number 9 on the list, and the last Stephen King book that I'm going to mention in this video before I move on to part 2, that will have to be Desperation, which I actually just read for my Patreon wheel spin. And for those of you who don't know, I get all of my patrons together and they get to pick a book that goes on the wheel that I spin, and whatever gets spun for the wheel is the book that I read in that given month. And this was the book that was randomly chosen, and I'm glad because I haven't read it in a while and I actually had a really good time with it. I give it 4 stars. I do actually like its companion novel a little more, which I'll get into in part 2 of this 90s thing. But like I said, I really did enjoy this one. I would give it around 4 stars. I won't go into too much detail. I'll just leave a link down below for the dedicated book review I did for this. I go into much more detail about what I liked and what I didn't like about the book. But yeah, just know that I did enjoy it, and it just missed the cut for like my favorite from the 1990s for Stephen King. It's still really good, 4 stars. Highly recommended for anyone who just wants to read a bonkers Stephen King book. Really good, and for that reason, Desperation is number 9 on the list. All right, that wraps up part 1 for my ranking 1990s Stephen King decades list ranking. And again, this was just part 1. Part 2 will come out next Friday, where I'll talk about the top 8, and those are like my favorite Stephen King books from the 1990s. Again, none of them I would put in my top 10, but a few of them I would put in my top 20. So there are still a lot of great Stephen King books left to talk about from the 1990s. But for this video, what did you guys think of it? Please let me know in the comments down below. And also, what did you guys think of my ranking? Did you agree with me on some of these, or did you completely disagree with me and thought that a lot of the books I talked about were great? Please let me know your ranking for the 1990s for Stephen King and leave it down in the comments below. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my YouTube channel and the Bookish Drummer Discord. And if you'd like to further support me financially, go check out my Patreon page and see what that's all about. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and have a terrific day.